just before I jump into my message today, we're going to be starting a new series called Grace is Greater. And I really wrestled with, do I preach about, the coronavirus, or are we going to go business as usual? And I just felt, you know what? Let's dive into this next series, and let's, I'm not even going to give Satan an opportunity even by giving one day to this in that sense, although we want to, absolutely address things. So I want to give you some words that are new, that have just been added to the dictionary, and tell me if you know what they are. The first one is Phoenicia. Have any of you ever heard? Can you throw that up for me? Anybody know what that means? Okay, Phoenicia is the affliction of dialing a phone number and forgetting whom you were calling just as they answer. I think that was supposed to be Phoenicia, okay? Phoenicia, maybe I'm saying it wrong, okay? How about this one? Disconfect. Disconfect, you ready? Disconfect is to sterilize the piece of candy you dropped on the floor by blowing on it, assuming this will somehow remove all the germs. Come on, how many of you have done it? You've done it, you've done it, you've done it, you've done it. That Tootsie Roll with just a little bit of gravel on it, you've done it. You're a liar. Every single person who does not have their hand up is a liar. No, it now has a name. If you just pick it up, not disconfect. If you blow on it, then it's disconfect. The next one is blame storming. Blame storming, right? It's collectively or individually finding someone or something to blame for a problem. You don't ever point at your wife, dude. Ever. Vinny just looked at me and went, you never ever do that. It's kind of fun that it's just us today. Oh, man. Now, unlike these words, right, grace is a term that we've heard and we've used countless times. And there's a danger that comes with becoming so familiar with a term, right? And the word grace is so common that, let's be honest, it's no longer amazing. We sing the song Amazing Grace, and we kind of lose the fact that grace really is amazing. So we're going to have just kind of a short 3-week series leading. Can you believe that in 4 weeks is Palm Sunday? It's almost spring, folks. This winter we've had, it feels like it's been fall the whole winter, right? But what we're going to do over these next 3 weeks is we're going to dig into what grace actually means versus what we kind of assume or what we've come to believe that it means. I want you to know this, that grace is more beautiful, freeing, and it's altogether greater than we can imagine. So this symbol up here that you see, Grace is Greater, is from a book by Kyle Idleman. And we're going to kind of use that book as our, so if you've read the book and you hear some of the things that I say, yes, I'm borrowing things from Kyle Idleman, and absolutely we're doing that. I always try to give credit where credit's due. If you would like to read the book as we're going through this series, you're welcome to do that as well. So we're going to talk about grace. And by definition, grace is the free and unmerited favor of God. Let me say that again. You can say it with me if you want. It's the free and unmerited favor of God. And here's what unmerited means. Unmerited means undeserved. You don't deserve God's favor. By definition, grace is given to us what we don't deserve and what we can't earn. And so I want to talk to you. We're going to talk today out of a story that comes to us from the book of John that beautifully illustrates and demonstrates grace. So, John, we're going to start in the 3rd verse here. It says this, so he being Jesus, left Judea and he returned to Galilee. Verse 4, he had to go through Samaria on the way. So Samaria, we've talked about this a few times. Samaria and Samaritans, they were a half-breed race. They were Jewish and they were Gentile, and they were kind of not loved by either. And Samaria was kind of, for older folks, they would say they lived on the other side of the tracks. It was the bad section of town. It was the area, it was the place you didn't go to Samaria. It was a place you went through. And you didn't stop and you didn't buy things in Samaria. You didn't talk to people. If you were a good Jewish man or woman, you didn't stop and spend the night in Samaria. You didn't go to the stores in Samaria. You just walked through Samaria. You kept going to get where you wanted to be. Verse 5 says, eventually he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon, verse 7, a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, well, please give me a drink. She was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. And the woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. And she said to Jesus, you're a Jew, and we can put in there, in parentheses, and a man. Okay? This isn't 2020. Guys didn't talk to women. And Jewish guys didn't talk to Samaritans, and Jewish guys definitely didn't talk to Samaritan women. So put a little comma in there. You're a Jew and a man. And I'm a Samaritan. Here, see it? Woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? And Jesus replied, if you only knew the gift that God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. And the first thing I want you to catch this morning, it's in your notes, is this, that God's grace is more beautiful than your brokenness. That favor, that unmerited favor of God is more beautiful than your brokenness. See, the first thing we notice in this story about this woman at the well is her brokenness. Now, here's what I want you to catch if you don't know the background of this story. For her to be at a well at noontime spoke volumes. Women did not go out to the well in the middle of the day. They would go in the morning, and then they would go again in the evening. That was the practice. But a woman who was an outcast, a woman who had been shunned by society, she would be the one who would sneak out in the middle of the day because she couldn't associate with good people in the morning and good people in the evening. And so we're going to see in just a couple of moments that this woman is broken. This woman has a past. This woman's an outcast. This is that woman, her. The one that at parties they would whisper about, and not openly, but kind of point at. Her. You know her. You know what she's done. You know the things. You know her. And this isn't a big community. It's a small community. So everybody knows who this woman is. And her past has caught up with her to the point that she no longer even associates with good people by going in the morning and the evening. She sneaks out in the middle of the day to do what she has to do. Catch this. When God's grace and God's mercy collide with our shame and our guilt, it's messy, but it's beautiful. And every single one of us, every single person in this room, we have broken pieces in our lives that only God can heal. And like this woman, Jesus knows everything you've done. Jesus knows everything you did. But he wants to make sure that you know, listen, that his grace, his favor is greater. How many of us can identify with the story that Jesus tells about the prodigal son? Right? The prodigal son comes to his dad and he says, I know you're not dead, Dad, but I'd like my inheritance now. How many of you could liquidate enough to get your kids their inheritance? I could totally do that, bud, because you're getting nothing, okay? The best thing about being poor is there's nothing to give away, right? So just don't be surprised. Nothing there, right? So, but can you imagine the audacity? Dad, I'll take my inheritance now. And so he takes his inheritance and he goes away and he squanders. Not only does he take his inheritance, but he takes off and he squanders his inheritance. We can kind of identify with that prodigal son, can't we? And the prodigal son, after he squandered his inheritance and after he squandered what his dad had worked to give to him, he realizes that he's in such a bad place. He realizes that he needs to go back home in order to survive. And so he makes the decision that he's going to go back home and be a servant. Dad, I don't even deserve the right of being a servant, of being a son. I'll be a servant at your house. He makes that decision, and he begins his journey home. And Scripture says this, Jesus tells a story, that when he was a far way off, his dad has binoculars out looking for his son. Doesn't that say something about what he expected from his son? While he was a long way off, he saw him, and he ran to him, and he threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. And he not only restored his place at his home, but he restored his position as his son. What a beautiful story of how God, right, redeems us and how God graciously loves every single one of us. I wonder this morning if the worst thing that could happen is that we spend our life trying to outrun God because we think God is chasing us to collect something from us. He's chasing us because we think we owe God something, when in reality, he's really chasing us to give us something that we could never afford. A couple of months ago, I was at Walmart. Have you ever taken money? Have you ever said, oh, yeah, okay, I'll take $20 at Walmart? Like every other place, it holds your card until you take the money, and then it gives you, Walmart doesn't do that, right? And so I forgot to take the money. So I walked out, and I got in my truck, and this guy from Walmart comes out, and he knocks on my door, and he goes, can I see your receipt? And I looked at him and went, are you kidding me? No offense, but I'm a middle-aged white guy. No, I'm kidding, man. I'm just kidding. And I said, really? You're following me out to see if I stole something? He said, can I see your receipt? I said, yeah, here's my receipt. He said, yeah, you forgot to take your $20. What if we do the same thing with God? We think God's chasing after us to punish us. We think God's chasing after us to take from us. We think God's chasing us to collect a bill from us, when in actuality, God's chasing us to give us something we could never afford in the first place. You may think, wow, you know what? I've used up all of God's grace. You may think, you know what? God has nothing left for me. I've messed up too many times. I've messed up too big. God would never, ever, ever, ever have enough grace for me. Can I tell you something this morning? God's grace is an unlimited supply. We can't exhaust God's grace. Can we abuse God's grace? Yes. There comes a place where we no longer are really repentant. That's on our end. That's not on God's end. But when we come to God and we're truly repentant and we truly fall at his feet, we can never exhaust the grace of God. So our story continues. Let's jump back in here in John. Verse 11 says this. She's talking now. And he's just said, I can give you something that'll change your life, basically. And she says, but sir, you don't have a rope. This water that you're talking about, you don't have a rope and you don't even have a bucket. And this well's very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think that you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoy? Now, let me just say real quick here that this well, this very well was famous. This was a famous well for being very deep and for the amount of water that it produced. This well was a famous well because it had pure, unlimited, it seemed like, water. And so she says, listen, if you think you have a better well than this well, you might be out of your depth here, because this is the well of wells. And Jesus replied, you ready? Anyone who drinks this water, they're going to be thirsty again. But those who drink the water I will give will never be thirsty again. It becomes fresh, a bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Well, please, sir, the woman said, give me this water, then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water. Now, I love what Jesus does next, verse 16. Okay, well, why don't you go get your husband, Jesus said. Interesting, right? Like all of a sudden, if you've never read this story before, you've never heard this story before, like, where's he going? Her husband, okay. Well, I don't have a husband, she says. Jesus said, you're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't married to the man that you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth. Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. We'll stop there. Come back in and finish the story in just a moment. In your notes, here's what happens here for her. She recognizes that this man is the real deal. And when we recognize, right, the ugliness of our sin, the more we can appreciate the beauty of God's grace. See, sometimes I think that we are so cavalier about sin. I think there are times when we actually downplay how grievous our sin is to God. And we say, oh, you know, God, your grace is bigger and your grace is greater. And we can become callous to the reality of our sin. And our ability to appreciate grace is in direct correlation to the degree to which we acknowledge our need of it. When we think, oh, you know what, God, it's good, but, I can handle this myself. God, you're big, but I can deal with this on my own. God, I know you forgive sins, but you know what? I bet you don't even really care about what I'm involved in. I bet you don't really care about. Instead, when we come and we say, you know what, God, I'm a sinner. And there's nothing I can do outside of your grace. There's no way, and I'm going to talk about this in just a minute, there's no way I could possibly make this right on my own. And as long as we justify our actions that are self-destructive, both physically and spiritually, we will never truly understand and embrace the grace that is offered to us. So I have a friend who jokes all the time. And he says, I'm earning my way to heaven. He's like, we were on youth staff together. He was one of my youth staff members when he'd say, I'll pay for the kids to go to youth convention. I'll pay for a kid to go to camp or something because I want to pay my way. I want to earn my way to heaven. And we'd always laugh about it, right? But the joke is like we could ever earn our way to God, right? Because we're talking about a God who holds everything in his hand, right? Like God's like earth. Yeah, that's like there. This is God's hand, and we think, oh, God's got the world. No, God's got like all of it in his hand, right? And we're like, yeah, God, I'm going to do for you something obviously you need. God's like, you're kidding, right? Because God owns everything, and God needs nothing. So how in the world could we possibly earn our way to God? How could we absolutely think that we have something to offer to God? Think about it another way. Think about trying to buy something that would impress Bill Gates. Right? There's nothing, if we all collectively put all of our money together to buy Bill Gates a gift that would impress him, right? We couldn't do it. Because there's nothing that we could purchase that Bill Gates could not purchase for himself. There's nothing on Amazon that Bill Gates is like, wow. Right? And yet, somehow, we think that we could somehow impress God. Have you ever said anything like this? God, if you would, I will. God, if you would just heal Grandma, I'll go to church for a year. God's like, I don't need you to go to church. Right? God, if you would just let me win the lottery, I'll give 5% to the church. I cannot tell you how many people tell me that. When I win the lottery, I'll tithe. If you can't tithe now, what makes you think you're going to tithe then? Because if you can't tithe $25 a week, what makes you think you're going to tithe $250 million? If you can't trust God with a little, right? And so we think we could somehow bargain with a God who has everything and needs nothing. There's literally nothing that you and I could buy or to give to God that would make it worth it. And so that's where grace comes in, isn't it? We need grace. Grace is the favor of God for those who don't deserve it and have nothing to offer in exchange for it. And so for us to fully understand the magnitude of grace, we first have to own the gravity of our condition. And the gravity of our condition and the reality of our condition is that we have nothing to offer to God. That we have nothing that is good enough or big enough or great enough in exchange for God's grace. That's the reality of our situation. And the beauty of grace is that God offers it to us for free. So here's what we do. We work hard at convincing ourselves and others that we're not that bad, right? Have you ever heard that? I'm not that bad. And we all do that, right? But the reality is that we are far worse than we've ever imagined. And the more we push back on that, the more you push back on experiencing God's grace. See, a perfect God, here's what we have to understand, that a perfect God can only demand perfection. A perfect God can only demand perfection. He only wants, he only needs, he can only ever desire from us perfection. And none of us can even come close to that standard. There's no way that we can attain that. So we need a benefactor who can make up the difference. In other words, what we need is a Messiah. See, a Messiah means a deliverer. A Messiah means deliverer. And so here's what happens. Let's continue the story in verse 25. The woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called the Christ. And when he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. It's one of the only times that Jesus openly says who he is. He says, I am the Messiah. Just then his disciples came back and they were shocked to find him talking to, look at what it says, a woman. But none of them had the nerve to ask, what do you want with her? Or what do you want with her? Or why are you talking to her? And the woman left her water jar beside the well, ran back to the village, telling everyone, come and see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be what he claims to be, the Messiah? And so the people came streaming from the village to see him. In your notes this morning, I want you to catch this. God's grace redeems all of our regrets. As I was writing that, I thought of Frank Sinatra. Regrets? I've had a few, right? We all we all look at grace and go, wow, I wish I had. We all look at grace and go, if I had done. I wish I could expunge. Boy, if I had just known better. We all look at grace and we have regrets. Look at what the woman says in verse 29. She said, come and see the man who told me everything I ever did. You know, I hesitate to say this. I may have used it. I know I've used it in small group, but it's something I'm so embarrassed about in my life. When I was 15 years old, me and a buddy were in an Ames store. Do any of you remember Ames, right? We're in an Ames store, and I stole something. As I was walking out, one of the security guards stopped me. I got arrested. Got to ride in the cop car to my house, and the cop banged on the door and said, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, here's your son. He's a thief. We laugh, but it's an embarrassing story in my life. It's not how I was raised. It's not things that I do or, certainly would not be proud of my kids if they did that, right? It's this regret I have in my life. So much so that I really don't like talking about it. And, it's not a big deal, I had to do community service, right? And the thing was, is we asked that I not do community service at a local church because my dad was a pastor. So where'd they have me do community service? At the Methodist church in town, right? So just took it even further into my guilt. I could tell you I never, ever shoplifted after that. Ever, right? And, but it's one of those things that it's in my past, and it's hard to talk. You have those things that it's just hard to talk about. It's uncomfortable because it makes you feel those feelings again of embarrassment and regret. And to regret, by definition, is to feel loss or disappointment or dissatisfaction about something. See, our regret, real regret, leads to remorse. And that's the correct response when we're confronted with our sin. Remorse that says, what, I don't want to do this again. I never want to repeat this again. I want to change. But here's the really good news, that's where God's grace will most often find you. But here's the best part of this. God's grace finds us in our moment of regret, but God's grace won't leave us there. That's what grace does. So I wonder this morning, what regrets do we try to hide? What regrets are you trying to hide? Thinking that they're so big that they're unforgivable even by God. Like it's too big to even bring it to God. I'm embarrassed, so embarrassed by it. I'm so remorseful. I'm so filled with regret that I don't even want to talk to God about it. See, here's what Jesus does. Jesus acknowledges the woman's sin. She obviously had regrets. She obviously was trying to avoid her past. She obviously knew that this made her a pariah in her community. And so she's out in the middle of the day where nobody else is going to see her at this moment. She doesn't want to be confronted with her past. She doesn't want to be confronted with the things that she's done and her regrets and her mistakes. So Jesus acknowledges her sin. Jesus doesn't let her off. Jesus says, no, this is what you've done. But you don't have to stay there. See, Jesus didn't condemn her and he didn't disqualify her because of them. Instead, Jesus offers her the one thing, the only thing that will ever satisfy her and settle her debt with God. Jesus offered her himself. Jesus offered her himself. And what was her response? Her response was to go back into the town, right? And tell others of the experience that she had had. See, she was given grace and she invited others to share in it. Isn't that what grace is about? It's too big just for me. I need other people to enjoy it as well. You know what she became? She became a trophy of God's grace. Now, here's what a trophy does. A trophy acknowledges an attainment. A trophy is an admission of an achievement. A trophy is an appreciation of an accomplishment. And our lives can be one of two things. Our lives can be reminders of our failure and our past and our regrets and our mistakes. Or, like this woman in our story, we even have things in our lives that are so big that we don't want anybody to know about it, and so we sneak out. We try to skirt any kind of confrontation that would remind us of it. She became a pariah because of her past. But Jesus turns all of that around in a moment, and she goes from an outcast to a proclaimer. She goes from a trophy of regret to a trophy of God's goodness and God's grace. See, her whole life up to that point, I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. Her whole life up to that point had just been a reminder of what her past mistakes had been. Every time she turned around, she was reminded, I'm that woman. I'm the woman who's had 5 husbands in a small community, and it isn't 2020 where it's okay. Her whole life had been a reminder that she had been in and out of relationships. Her whole life had been a reminder that she wasn't good enough. She wasn't pure enough. But Jesus, in a moment, turned her life around. She became a trophy of God's goodness, God's grace, and God's obsessive love and forgiveness for her. So I wonder this morning, do we let our past mistakes destroy our lives? Or instead, do we become a trophy of God's grace? Say, you know what? Yep, I've made mistakes. I've got regrets. There's disappointment in my life, but Jesus loves me anyways. And He's turned my life around, and He's changed my story around, and He's changed my future around. Because if we realize our need for God's grace and submit ourselves to Him, His grace transforms our lives. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. I want to pray with you. And then I asked the worship team to hold back one song so we could just declare today how good our God is. And walk out of here with a proclamation. Not of defeat. Not of regrets. Not of past disappointments. Not of what we used to be. I don't know how many of you had nicknames in high school. Some of them are good, some of them are not so much. Maybe you felt like you were that person. God says you're not anymore. You're a child of the King. So live in grace. You're my trophy. God looks down on every single one of us and He goes, my grace is greater than my shoplifting. Right? You fill in the blank. The thing that seems too big for God, you don't even like talking about it. You don't even like thinking about it. You don't want to go there. God's grace is greater. God, I pray for every person in this room right now who struggles with past disappointments and past hurts. God, past failures, and they just feel like they're too big for you. Would you remind us that your love and your grace are greater? Pray that we'd walk out of here recognizing, God, that we're not a culmination of our past failures. We are a culmination of one choice that we made, and that was to receive your grace. Pray if there's anybody here who's struggling with that today, or anyone that's here that's never accepted your grace. Pray that today would be the day that we make that declaration that God's grace is greater. And we live in the freedom that comes with it. In the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen.